May the Spirit bless our contemplation of the Word. Amen. So I don't know about you, but when I read that gospel, I say to myself, did Jesus really call that woman a dog? Either this is not the Jesus we know, or I'm wondering if Matthew didn't get the story straight. You know, the Gospels were put together because there were lots of stories about Jesus that people remembered, and they knew them well. And you have to remember that people in that day sort of had better memories than we did because not too many of them were literate. But I have to say, did Matthew get it right that Jesus called somebody a dog? It usually makes people cringe when they read this gospel story, and it makes preachers want to say, maybe I should preach on the Old Testament lesson instead. But here we are with this difficult story, and I was taught that if you read a difficult story, you darn well better comment on it so you don't keep people wondering what in the world is going on. So I'm going to give you my musings this morning. And I'll kind of go through the story piece by piece. So Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. So Jesus kind of crossed a boundary line. And in his life so far in Matthew, what Matthew records is that Jesus was followed by huge crowds. A couple weeks ago, we had the feeding of the 5,000, and that was because there was this gigantic crowd that was following him, and they followed him into the wilderness. And there were multitudes, and they all wanted something. Or they wanted good news. A lot of them wanted healing. And so Jesus had to have been a little exhausted. And so he went out of his own territory into another territory. As I was thinking about that, I was remembering an incident from my first congregation. It was a long time ago. And I held up a globe. And I said, and it was a topographical globe, so it didn't have all of the countries delineated out. There were no lines. It's kind of like the Earth from space that we all see. And I said, so, God created the Earth without lines, without territorial markers. And I started, saying how we needed to start, maybe seeing things a little differently. It would be helpful. And one woman in the congregation just couldn't sit still. She just couldn't do it. So right in the middle of the sermon, she says, wait a minute. What about us? Don't we have to protect what we have? Well, she wasn't getting my point, for one thing. But we have decided as a human race that we need to have lines and draw lines. And Jesus was going into somebody else's territory. There was a line. Now, God told the people of Israel that they could have a land. So we can't blame them, really. I mean, from their belief was that they had this territory. But, in my crazy imagination, I wonder if God decided in the long run if that was a great idea. Because we see where it's led, and even what's going on today when we deal with boundaries. Boundaries. So there's a part of them that can be good, and there's this other part that we really need to see all of us together as human beings, as related to one another, and not worry so much about boundaries. And that's what the ecological movement is doing when we call it earth care. It's not St. Andrew Property Care, it's not United States Care, although it's part of that, but it's earth care. We're caring for the whole earth. So anyway, Jesus is in this other territory, and of course, someone from that territory comes up to him. Now, he didn't know who she was and his disciples. She was a Canaanite woman from that region. But she knew who he was and what he could offer. And she asked for mercy for her sick daughter. My daughter is tormented by a demon. Have mercy on her. And what she meant by that is, heal her because I know you can. Heal her. Now, I think the disciples were a bit offended by her yelling. She was shouting. And I have to say, I thought of another story from early on. This is before I was even in the ministry, where I went to a retreat, a 3-day retreat. And we were all gathered in there not knowing what to expect quite. And the leadership team got up and started talking. And there was this one woman who was, she was very imposing. I think she had on overalls, I'm not sure. And her voice was loud. And she would interrupt people when they were talking, and she would just be out there and know, everybody knew that she was in the room. And being the shy, retiring Swede that I am, I immediately said, no, I don't want to be around this person. Well, later, as we started getting into the introduction to the retreat, they announced that we would be divided into groups, and that would be our group for the whole 3 days. Now, you can imagine whose group I was put in. So God had a lot to teach me during that retreat, when I had to come to terms with someone that initially I couldn't relate to and I didn't like. But she had a lot to teach me, and it was a very good retreat. So I'm wondering if this outrageous, audacious woman is being set up to be a teacher in this story. I have to ask myself that. So she's out there shouting. She knows who Jesus is, Lord, Son of David. She knows that he is not a Canaanite, that he is an Israelite. But she also knows that he is a prophet representing God. Well, his disciples had a solution. They said, send her away. They didn't like the disruption. Send her away. But Jesus said to and Jesus kind of affirmed that, actually. He said, well, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And there's no question about that, particularly in Matthew. Jesus is seen as the new Moses who's going to lead the people out in a new direction. So he was a reform movement within Judaism. He was there to put his own house in order. And he saw that as his mission before he could go out into other areas, into all the world, as we say. So it's true that there's something about putting your own house in order before you can impact others that's very significant. So in some ways, you can't fault Jesus on that. Although I think it's interesting that he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep, and his disciples are standing right there. So they have to deal with whether they're the lost sheep or not. Nevertheless, the woman persisted. She persisted. Some of you recognize that. Nevertheless, she persisted. But this time she took a different tack. She came and knelt before Jesus and just said, Lord, help me. She humbled herself to beg. And Jesus has a very strange answer to her. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Wow, that's harsh. So in my study this week, I learned something about dogs in that time. In the Israelite world, the dogs were not allowed in the house. So if you were going to feed the dogs, you had to take whatever you're going to feed them, and you had to go outside the house and give it to them. So she's outside the house. But in the Canaanite world, the dogs were allowed in, and they would kind of hang around under the table, as dogs are wont to do. If you have a dog, some of them might do that, to see what drops, especially under the children, to see what food drops out. So can or should Jesus go outside his mission at this point? Should he? And I often say to people who are thinking of doing too much or going outside, what their thought is to, maybe you should stay in your lane. Should Jesus have stayed in his lane? So nevertheless, she persisted by sparring with Jesus. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She's willing to sit under the table and wait. She will humble herself to that extent because she needs mercy. She needs mercy. Sitting under the table. Finally, Jesus has to say, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done. Let it be done. Great is your faith." So I'm wondering if faith is another word for persistence. We think of faith as believing in certain things, but maybe it is persistence that is great faith, at least in this story. Jesus calls her woman. And one of my favorite commentators, I've dropped my glasses, talks about that, and I thought it would be interesting to read about that. The title woman that Jesus uses is not simply a description of her gender. It is certainly a far cry from dog. I suspect that it means the one who gives life. Woman. And the one who gave life, the one she gave life to, is the one who calls her woman. "O woman, great is your faith." And I take the O to suggest a shock of recognition, a sudden revelation. The pestering one becomes the bearer of a deeper truth. This is her great faith. Through persistence and cleverness, she reminded Jesus of his true identity. He is a Jew, but most importantly, he is Lord. It is remarkable to hear him say he will do the will of this woman. Could it be that in the woman's words he hears the voice of his Father in heaven? His Father's voice came down from the sky, but it also speaks from the earth. Through the people who search for mercy in a demon-ridden world, whenever and wherever Jesus hears his Father's voice, he is alert, ready to touch. Let the Spirit flow. And that is what happened. Her daughter was healed. Persistence is another word for faith here. First she shouts, then she kneels to beg, and then she challenges Jesus with humility, willing to sit under the table. I was reminded of one more thing as I was thinking about these things. There's a famous quote from The Imitation Game, the story of Alan Turing, the mathematician and computer scientist, code breaker. I don't know if you saw that movie, but the most quoted thing from that movie is this quote. Sometimes it's the people no one imagines anything of who do the things no one can imagine. Sometimes it's the people no one imagines anything of who do the things no one can imagine. I saw that in this story of the Canaanite woman. No one thought a thing of her. And yet she was able to remind Jesus of his true identity, that he was there to offer mercy and to offer healing. So it makes me wonder about who we should be listening to in our culture, particularly in our culture. Is it the one no one thinks anything of? Is it the one from across that imaginary line who people are saying don't belong? Who is it that we, as God's people, should be listening to? I'll leave you with that wondering. Amen.